is Thursday, November 11th here at Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Veterans Day here in the United States. So thank you very much. If you served our country, we appreciate your contributions. Welcome to the Week 10 Preview Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schauf. With me, as always, is Jared Smola. And Jared, let's jump into a Thursday night game. It's got Baltimore at Miami. The Ravens by 7.5 on the road in this one, over under 46.5. And on the Baltimore side, we're going to see if Sammy Watkins is finally ready to play. Put in a full practice Wednesday, still questionable for the game. I mean, it doesn't really matter for whether Sammy Watkins is in lineups. I wouldn't be playing him, but it could matter if you've been playing Rashad Bateman, especially in a deeper type of league the past couple weeks.
Yeah, definitely adds downside to Bateman. I mean, the Ravens spent a first-round pick on him. He's been good in all three games now. Like, I'd be surprised if his playing time takes a big dive with Watkins in there, but it could dip a bit. And, it already wasn't a full-time player to begin with. Might not be a huge passing volume game from the Ravens side if the Dolphins can't kind of keep up. So I think Bateman's down to like a risky wide receiver 3, assuming Watkins is active.
Yeah, it adds risk to Bateman. We really don't know the effect yet because we haven't seen Rashad Bateman and Sammy Watkins on the field together yet. But it is a lower volume pass offense usually when they're winning, and I think we both expect them to win pretty easily against these Dolphins tonight. So there's risk to playing Bateman. There's upside. He did go 5 for 52 against the Vikings last week, saw 8 targets. The Ravens threw 41 times in that game, which was a shootout. He had a couple of deep balls, did Bateman, that could have made it a truly big game that just missed. Like Lamar Jackson was short for him a couple of times. One was wiped out by a defensive pass interference penalty. So he could be coming off a big game. It looks like he's a key part of the offense. I don't think that they're going to significantly limit his role, but again, we don't know what it's going to mean for targets or playing time once Watkins is back in the lineup.
Yeah, Bateman's at season highs in snaps and route rate and targets with 8 last week. So again, he's been trending up, and I sort of think Baltimore is just going to stick with that. But yeah, I mean, we won't know until this game starts tonight.
Yeah, maybe a little bit more Sammy Watkins, a little bit less Devin Duvernay, even though he made a nice catch in the end zone last week. Latavius Murray is doubtful for this game, so it doesn't look like we'll get him back. I wonder if even once Latavius Murray comes back, if it's still going to be Devontae Freeman leading the backfield, because he's playing well for them, and he's coming off probably his best game with the team. Worked as the top back against Minnesota. He's averaging 5.7 yards per carry. Some of that's the Lamar effect, but like I said, Freeman has looked pretty good.
He's looked pretty good, and he kind of separated himself from the other two guys, Le'Veon Bell and Tyson Williams last week. Freeman was up to 58% of the snaps. He got 13 of the 24 running back carries. Le'Veon Bell got the other 11. Freeman also got 3 targets last week. He was actually 14th among running backs in our expected fantasy points, so the usage was pretty strong for him last week. Solid matchup tonight as, decent sized favorites against a kind of mediocre Dolphins run defense. I mean, the risk is Baltimore could easily switch back and, play more Le'Veon Bell or play my Tyson Williams tonight. So it's not a lock, but if Freeman's in the role he was in last week, I think, he's like an RB2 for this week.
Yeah, and he was the first running back in that game. He played 57 snaps to Le'Veon Bell's 23. Tyson Williams played 18. Freeman and Bell split carries in overtime, 4 for each of them, but Freeman got all 3 of the running back targets for that game if you don't count Patrick Ricard's targets in that group, because he's not exactly the same kind of guy. So I would play Freeman tonight. Obviously not a high level play, but if you're in the level where you're like, okay, which Baltimore running back is it? It looks like Devontae Freeman. It looks like he should be a solid play tonight.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything else on the Baltimore side?
Nope.
The Miami side, Tua is still questionable with that finger fracture on the left hand. Limited this week, was limited all last week as well, so I don't know how much we can get from that. Do you know what the chances are that Tua plays tonight? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry, battling a cold here. I was a game time decision for the pod. I mean, the report last week was that he tried to warm up in pregame and that he couldn't throw hard enough or far enough with that fractured finger. So I kind of think it's going to be Brissett tonight. I kind of hope it is for the Dolphins skill guys. Like, I think it'd just be a lot less downside there. So that's kind of what I'm expecting. Obviously, Tua or Brissett, they're just quarterback 2s, depending on who's in there.
I mean, not throwing far enough or hard enough hasn't stopped Ben Roethlisberger from playing, so I'm not sure I understand the problem for Miami. But we'll see who the quarterback is. Officially questionable. We'll get that about an hour and a half before kickoff tonight. No Tua last week. No Devontae Parker, who landed on IR ahead of last week's game. We got 10 Jalen Waddle targets in that game. We got 8 for Mike Gesicki. We got 6 apiece for Myles Gaskin and Mac Hollins. I think that we should expect similar usage for Waddle, Gesicki, Gaskin, and I mean, it's another game where we expect them to fall behind. So it should be a solid bet for target volume for all 3 of those players.
Yeah, pretty concentrated offense without Devontae Parker. Jalen Waddle, Mike Gesicki, and Myles Gaskin have all seen more targets per game without Parker than with him. So, pretty easy offense to project. And I do think Gesicki, Waddle, and Gaskin are all like, mid-range fantasy starters tonight.
Mm-hmm. On top of those 6 targets, Gaskin got 20 of 24 running back carries. He took those 20 carries for a whopping 34 yards against Houston, got a touchdown on the ground, plus good receiving work. I wonder if that whole combo of what he did last week, fantasy-wise, makes Myles Gaskin a big sell this week. I mean, it's tough because we're doing this on Thursday afternoon and he plays Thursday night. So, there's not a whole lot of time to do that, but it looks to me like it might be a good time to try as hard as you can to sell Myles Gaskin.
Yeah, I was surprised to see him get 20 carries in that game last week. The receiving usage has been there all season, which is nice. Especially in a short week, I would sort of expect the rushing volume to come down. But he's obviously Miami's lead back, and I think he's a solid play tonight against the Ravens defense that's just sort of been mediocre all season.
Mm-hmm. And they might be without Brandon Williams again at defensive tackle, which always dings the run defense. Anything else from that game?
Nope, that'll do it.
Tampa Bay at Washington, the Bucks by 9.5, over under a 51.5. Is Antonio Brown going to play this week?
No, he's nowhere close to playing. Based on everything we've seen and heard, and Rob Gronkowski, I don't think he's going to play this week either. Bruce Arians been on Sirius Radio this morning, and he said Gronk is still 2 or 3 weeks away from being back to 100%. So, and then Chris Godwin was the add to the injury report on Wednesday. So this Bucks passing game is all sorts of beat up. So I'm probably going to have to wait till Friday to really get a good idea of who's going to be available.
Yeah, Scotty Miller was designated to return from IR this week. We'll see if he's actually back on the active roster by game time. Tyler Johnson could be a deep option if we're expecting to be without Antonio Brown, even though he's shed his walking boot at least. And we might be without Chris Godwin as well. That certainly might be enough to make Tyler Johnson a viable fantasy start this week. So we'll kind of have to see where everything is by the weekend. And then if both of those wideouts plus Gronk are out, and it's looking likely for Brown and Gronk, Jalen Darden could at least be a DFS flyer here.
They also signed Rashad Perriman to the practice squad this week. He spent 2019 with the Bucs, so has some familiarity with the offense, not necessarily with Brady. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see who's available. I mean, I think you're probably starting Brady regardless. No AB, no Gronk, and no Chris Godwin, if that's the case, would certainly lower the ceiling on him.
Yeah. But there's still Tom Brady and Mike Evans. So I think he'll be all right. And I think that I'll continue forgetting that Rashad Perriman exists. On defense, the Bucs might get Carlton Davis and Sean Murphy-Bunting back at corner for this game. Both of those guys are nearing returns from IR. Carlton Davis we'll see this week. Sean Murphy-Bunting got designated to return last week when they were on bye. So we'll see if he's ready to play. That would certainly help the defense. Not sure how much it matters for this particular matchup, though, because there just aren't that many players in Washington with decent fantasy outlooks.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's McLaurin who, man, looking at his weekly finishes, the biggest boomer bust wide receiver in fantasy this season. He has 3 weeks inside the top 5 wide receivers. He's been outside the top 45 in the other 4. I mean, this is a game you could see him boom because he should have volume on the side of Washington playing from behind. But I could also see Washington's offense, not doing a whole lot. Tampa's pasty, by the way, they're up to 10th in Football Outsiders DVOA. They're still a decent matchup because teams throw at them at such a high rate. But it's not a bad pass defense. So careful with McLaurin. He probably got to start him, but he obviously has a much lower floor than you'd like to see.
And certainly understandable that he would rank among the bigger boom bust guys. He's set up to be a boom bust player. He's good. He's the dominant number 1 receiver. He's got Taylor Heineke as his quarterback. He's got absolutely nothing around him on offense. So, yeah, that's how it's going to be. Probably starting him and then crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. Logan Thomas is a maybe to return. Ron Rivera said that after Thomas returned to practice on Monday, his hamstring was sore. He's, of course, missed the past 4 games. They had their bye. Not on the active roster yet, so we're not going to get injury reports on Logan Thomas during the week. We'll probably have to wait until Friday to see what his status is.
Yeah, or even Saturday. I think that's the deadline for them to officially activate him off IR. So we'll see. I mean, I think when Thomas is healthy, he'll take back the lead role. You know, Washington gave him a pretty big contract recently. So I do think he's going to be the guy, even though Ricky Seals-Jones has played pretty well in his absence. I think ideally, though, you give Thomas a week just to see the role, see that he's healthy before getting him back into fantasy lineups.
I agree. I think RSJ has at least played well enough that if they're not sure how Logan Thomas is going to be, they limit his role, maybe even just have him as kind of an emergency option for that first game back. So I would like to not play him if I can help it. The backfield, Antonio Gibson remained limited coming out of the bye in Wednesday's practice. Still got the shin issue, so is just going to be managing that for a while still, it seems. And his playing time has been down each of the past 3 games.
I mean, we heard right when we found out this was a stress fracture that it's not going to get better unless they sit him for multiple weeks. So I don't think the bye week's going to have done a whole lot for Gibson. I'm sure it helped a little, but he's still not going to be 100%. He's finished outside the top 30 running backs and half PPR points in each of his last 3 games. And now he gets this brutal matchup against the Bucs. You know, we know teams barely even try to run on them. I think J.D. McKissic is the best play in Washington's backfield this week. He's going to have game flow on his side with Washington likely playing from behind. Tampa Bay is 25th in Football Outsiders running back coverage rankings, and they've allowed the 7th most catches to running back. So I think McKissic should have a pretty busy and productive game in the passing game on Sunday.
They've allowed the 2nd most running back receptions per game of any defense in the league behind only Cincinnati, while also seeing the league's fewest running back carries. So yeah, I agree. This is a good week to play J.D. McKissic. 10, 6, and 8 targets in those past 3 games with a limited Antonio Gibson that we already mentioned. And, you know, as you said, this is a spot where all opponents are like, well, we're not going to run the ball very much against them. We're just going to keep throwing it. It could be a big game of usage for J.D. McKissic. I agree.
Yep.
Anything else in that game?
No.
Detroit at Pittsburgh. Steelers by 8.5, over under 42.5. DeAndre Swift, TJ Hawkinson, really the only guys worth a look. And just to, I guess, emphasize that, Khalif Raymond is our top-ranked Lions wideout. He's 63rd in the PPR ranks, 1 spot behind Tajay Sharp.
Yes, it's Hawkinson and Swift. You know, Hawkinson looked as healthy as he has in a while prior to the bye. Had an 11-target game, so that was good to see. Jamal Williams still did not practice on Wednesday with that thigh injury. You know, he missed the game previous to the bye. It's good news for Swift. I know Swift didn't deliver in that game before the bye against the Eagles, which is a blowout loss. But no, Jamal Williams is still good news for DeAndre Swift. Obviously, I think he's gonna get most of the running back work if Swift is out, if Jamal Williams is out.
Mm-hmm. And just to go back to Raymond, he's had flash spots, so we know that he could put up numbers in, you know, a game here and there, but he followed that big 6 for 115 game with just 1 target against Philly, and his weekly target counts have gone 4, 2, 10, 6, 2, 7, 8, 1. So you got to know that if you play Khalif Raymond, there's a chance that he completely disappears or a chance that he contributes something.
Yeah, try not to play Khalif Raymond.
Ideally. On the Steelers side, Chase Claypool seems like he's a good bet to be out because it was a positive report this week that he had a test on his injured toe and will not miss the rest of the season. Now, we don't know how long he's going to be out. They haven't put him on IR yet as of this recording. So we'll see how serious the injury is, but they called him week to week, which almost certainly means he'll miss this week's game.
Yeah, assuming he'll be out this week. So you're going to have James Washington will probably kick to the outside. He'd been playing in the slot, and then you're probably going to have Ray McLeod in the slot. I mean, I'm not sure how much more volume Deontay Johnson can get, but he might get even more with Chase Claypool out. So obviously playing Deontay Johnson, and Claypool's absence can't hurt Pat Freiermuth either. We'll see what happens when Eric Ebron's finally ready to return. You know, that might cut into Freiermuth's snaps a bit, but I think he's playing well enough, and he's going to see enough targets where, you know, you're starting him at this point, especially in this matchup against Detroit.
Yeah, we'll see what the effect is there. Obviously, it's, you know, certainly possible. It can only help Pat Freiermuth if Eric Ebron is out, but they picked him in the 2nd round despite a shoulder injury. All the indications have been that they really like him, that Ben Roethlisberger really likes him. He's been producing. So it's also entirely possible that Eric Ebron's return doesn't negatively impact Pat Freiermuth, and especially with Juju and Chase Claypool not around. I mean, there's room for 2 tight ends to be involved. Maybe Eric Ebron is part of the answer at slot receiver for them, as opposed to a challenge to Pat Freiermuth. So I would continue on with Pat Freiermuth and treat him as I did the past 2 weeks, rather than worry about Eric Ebron's return. And then we'll see whether there's reason to worry about Eric Ebron's return, the effect on him. So I like him as a play this week. James Washington is sneaky. He's had 2 games earlier this year of about 80% playing time. 1 Deontay Johnson missed, 1 Chase Claypool missed. Saw 5 targets in each of those games. So he's not going to be an awesome bet for target volume. But, if you're looking way down the list where you're considering guys like Tajay Sharp and Khalif Raymond, James Washington has some upside in that range.
Yeah, I still think James Washington's good. The problem is he's kind of like Chase Claypool, where he's a downfield guy, and Big Ben can't get the ball downfield anymore. Also, Pittsburgh is 25th in situation neutral pass rate over the last 4 weeks. They have gone run heavy, which is what they should do when you have Najee Harris and you have an old crappy quarterback. So I'm not super excited about Washington, even though he should basically be a full-time player at this point with Claypool out.
Mm-hmm. Anything else from that game?
Nope.
New Orleans at Tennessee, Titans by 3, over under a 44.5. And Jared, are we going to have to get through week 10 with no Alvin Kamara?
Possibly. I didn't see anything in last week's game, but he didn't practice on Wednesday. Nick Underhill called it a minor sprain. We don't know what ligament or whatever. It doesn't tell us a whole lot, but it sounds like it's not a major injury, but it might keep him out this week. So, if Mark Ingram's available in your league, grab him immediately, because he'd be a solid fantasy starter if Kamara does not play this week.
Yeah, make sure you have a contingency plan, whether it's Mark Ingram or another player. Just make sure you have somebody to start in that spot, just in case Kamara can't go, and we'll all be lighting a candle for him this week. If there is no Alvin Kamara in this game, I mean, Mark Ingram is a decent option. It's 9 carries, 5 catches last week against Atlanta, and he's looked pretty good since rejoining the Saints.
He looks like a guy who, left the Texans and went to a team that, has a shot to make the playoffs. He's looked re-energized.
It might just be those black pants and that and the mouth guards that they have in New Orleans too.
Yeah, he does look good in the Saints uniform. Volume alone, I think, would make him a fantasy starter. I'd expect 15 to 20 touches if Kamara's out.
I don't know if anybody watching remembers, but there was a few years ago where they had the report on the Saints having these special mouth guards that helped maximize guys' athleticism, had them running faster and jumping higher. But I haven't heard of any grand shift to the energizing mouth guards around the league since then.
I missed that one.
It's that and the juicy fruit. That's the other performance enhancer in New Orleans. Trevor Siemian threw for 249, 2 touchdowns against the Falcons. So he's not worthless. He's also not dragging anyone to fantasy relevance. So we'll see where it goes there. And it's tough to like anything among the pass catchers not named Kamara. Deontay Harris, though, past 3 healthy games, 8, 7, and 8 targets. So, I mean, if you're looking down the list for a PPR option, he's in like Jamal Agnew territory.
Yeah, the Saints still haven't named a Week 10 starting quarterback yet. I am expecting it to be Siemian. Sean Payton, and it was ugly for the first 3 quarters of that game, and Siemian kind of came to life in the 4th quarter. Sean Payton said afterward that he graded well after watching the tape, and if you look at the PFF grade, Siemian was 8th on the week in PFF grade, so he did play pretty well. So he's just kind of keeping Taysom Hill out of our fantasy lineups for now. Deontay Harris, volume has been nice the past couple weeks. He's still, 40 and 42% of the routes over the last 2 weeks. So that, he has a super low floor. Like, he's earning a lot of targets on limited routes. It's kind of tough to live that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as we've learned with Rondale Moore early in the season. Anything else on the Saints side?
Adam Troutman is a guy who, the playing time has been strong for about a month now, and he's seen 6 and then 7 targets over the last 2 games. So, not a tight end one, but if you're desperate, Troutman is someone to at least give a look to.
Mm-hmm. On the Titans side, AJ Brown limited Wednesday with a knee issue, not on the injury report Wednesday or Thursday in week 9, then sat out Friday's practice with that issue, was questionable for the game, but played against the Rams and, got his usual usage. So to me, it looks like just kind of the knee stuff that he's going to have to manage all year and not something to worry about. We'll obviously watch him, but shouldn't affect AJ Brown's availability or role in this game.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. I'll keep an eye on it. He's been awesome for about the past month now, averaging 10 targets per game over his last 4, a 34.5% target share. So, if Tennessee actually does start throwing it more, AJ Brown's volume could really spike. Tennessee, by the way, 56% pass rate in neutral situations last week. They were at 44% with Derrick Henry. So we didn't totally see it because they played with a lead for so much of that game versus the Rams, kind of surprisingly. But it does look like they're going to shift a decent bit towards the pass without Derrick Henry. So, good news for AJ Brown, obviously. Good news for Ryan Tannehill. Good news for Julio Jones, who he's off the injury report. His playing time, he was back up to 74% of the snaps last week and 84% of the routes. The box score production wasn't there, but Tennessee just didn't have to throw it a whole lot in that game. So Julio, he's in the wide receiver 3 mix for me. There's still a low floor. We haven't really seen him produce yet this season, but the playing time and the health seems like it's trending up. So he's worth a look, I think, if you're in need of a wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4.
Yeah, finally made it through a healthy game, not on the injury report, as you mentioned. He hasn't topped 5 targets in a game since week 2, and that's the only time that he's topped 4 catches all year or reached 60 yards. So there's probably upside because he's Julio Jones, but we can't be sure. So, lean his way, maybe not bet too heavily on him. The backfield for Tennessee was a committee against the Rams. It was Adrian Peterson as lead runner, Jeremy McNichols as lead receiver, and next in carries, Deontay Foreman, third. I thought he looked better than Adrian Peterson, though, when he got the ball.
I thought Foreman looked like the best of the 3 of them. I mean, we only saw a handful of touches for all 3, so I'm not going to make any sweeping conclusions. Right. McNichols led in snaps in a positive game script, which you'd think, he'd be on the field more if they're trailing. It was also, obviously Peterson's first game, Foreman's first game with the team. It's probably an evolving situation. Against the Saints, who are first in Football Outsiders run defense DVOA, 5th in adjusted points allowed to running backs, I would definitely try to avoid this backfield. McNichols would be my pick, though, if you need to play one of these Titans.
Yes, that would be my lean too, McNichols. And, I don't want to put too much weight on what the guy looked like, because it doesn't really matter what I think he looked like. It matters what the team think they look like. And we could very well get to the next game and have it be like, oh, Adrian Peterson looks better than Deontay Foreman this week. Neither guy, a strong bet for production, but something to keep in mind as we go forward and see how the touches get split up.
Yep.
Ryan Tannehill, fine but unexciting option this week. I think even after the big Matt Ryan game last Sunday, New Orleans is still a negative scoring matchup for quarterback fantasy points.
Yeah, again, I think Tannehill trending up with Julio healthy and the volume likely to be higher going forward than it was with Derrick Henry. But yeah, I think he's outside our top 12 quarterbacks this week because of the matchup.
Mm-hmm. Anything else from that game?
Nope.
Atlanta at Dallas. The Cowboys by 9.5, over under a 54.5 in this game. I don't know what to make of Matt Ryan. And it's probably further biasing me that he's on my FFPC main event roster the past 2 weeks. I did start him for maybe his worst game of the season against the Panthers. And then with Dak back, I obviously wasn't starting him last week against New Orleans for probably his best outing of the season. So I think I have to step back, look at it objectively as much as I can, and realize that that the game against the Panthers was really more of the outlier versus what he's done overall this season than last week's game was, and figure that Matt Ryan's a solid option this week against Dallas.
Yeah, here are Ryan's last 5 weekly finishes among quarterbacks. 3rd, 12th, 12th. Matt starts him against Carolina. He finishes 31st, and then he finishes 3rd last week. So he's been a top 12 quarterback in 4 of the last 5 weeks now. I don't think that level is sustainable without Calvin Ridley. Like, I still have concerns when, Russell Gage and Tajay Sharp are, your I guess 3rd and 4th options in the passing game. But I do think this game should be a shootout, or at least, Dallas, I think, is going to score. So I think Ryan's going to have the pass volume. Dallas's pass D has been decent this season. They're 7th in Football Outsiders DVOA, 18th in adjusted points allowed to quarterback. So I think it's sort of a middling matchup for Ryan. But again, I like the game environment, so I do think he's a decent spot setter this week. There's a couple guys I like better. Derek Carr, Carson Wentz, I think, are better options this week. But if you're in a deeper league and need a spot setter, I do think Ryan is okay this week.
Yeah, and I think Matt Ryan is right with those guys. Derek Carr has been the most solid player among the 3 this season. Carson Wentz, has the ceiling that his gunslinger approach gives him. But Matt Ryan has been mostly good, and this game has the highest over-under. So there should be garbage time, should be shootout potential to it. So Matt Ryan's a solid option, and I will continue starting Dak Prescott and hoping that Matt Ryan doesn't outscore him for the 2nd straight game. Calvin Ridley, the Falcons placed on the non-football injury list last week. So that means that he will miss this week's game. He will miss at least one more. And then we'll see beyond that. It's anyone's guess when he's going to be back on the football field.
Yeah, I'd still hold him if possible, because he's not coming back from an injury. So when he is back on the field, he should be back in a full-time role. I'm not messing with any of these Falcons wide receivers if I can help it. I mean, Russell Gage had the 8 targets last week, but he had 0 the week before. Olamide Zacchaeus scored twice last week, but he had just 3 targets, ran a route on just 57% of the dropbacks. Tajay Sharp is still playing ahead of Zacchaeus. So if you can help it, just Pitts and Cordell Patterson from this Falcons offense.
Yeah, we mentioned Tajay Sharp earlier. He's played 3 games now with no Calvin Ridley, 68% of the snaps or more in each of those, but the targets have gone 5, 6, 1. Russell Gage has been back for 3 games, 6, 0, 8 targets for him. The 6 came with Calvin Ridley. The 0 and the 8 came with no Calvin Ridley. So either of those guys could give you something, could give you absolutely nothing. I mean, treat them as such, and it's going to be a coin flip on whether you play them. Kyle Pitts, Cordero Patterson belong in lineups. Mike Davis is okay in like RB3 range for PPR, but his 2 targets last week marked the second time in the past 3 games that he saw 2 targets or fewer.
Yeah, Davis has averaged a little over 10 carries and 4 targets per game in the games Calvin Ridley had missed. So that's kind of the volume you're looking at. I think it kind of makes him a low-end RB3. This game, again, does have shootout potential, so I think that helps Davis a bit.
Thank goodness on the Dallas side that we get a clear rebound matchup in the Falcons. Yeah. So it makes it easier to bet on our Cowboys plays after a shockingly bad performance against the Broncos. I think, part of it is missing left tackle Tyron Smith. That obviously can't be the entire explainer for it. Dak Prescott said that his calf wasn't bothering him against Denver, but sure looked rusty in that game. I think the good news, especially just beyond the overall matchup, is that the Falcons are very poorly equipped to exploit any weaknesses in pass protection that Dallas might have this week.
Yeah, I think Tyron Smith. That's a good point. I think that mattered last week. Dak's first game back off injury was some rust. Dak did not play well. He got it going late in the fourth quarter to help fantasy teams, but he was just off. I expect him to be better. I expect the Cowboys offense to bounce back. Sounds like they'll finally get Michael Gallup back, which is good news, obviously. Amari Cooper's the one guy to watch. He's been battling the hamstring. He's still on the injury report. He was limited on Wednesday. Ended up playing just 58% of the snaps last week. Some of that was because of the score. They pulled him for a lot of the fourth quarter. But it's clear to me he's not 100% out there. And Cooper at less than 100% has really struggled throughout his career. So he's the one guy that he's a bit risky. I'd lean towards playing him just because of the matchup. But Cooper comes with some risk until that hamstring is not a problem anymore.
Yeah, I wouldn't lean as strongly to playing him as you normally would for a player of that caliber in a matchup of this caliber. Let's just hope that we don't get any more Malik Turner touchdowns this week.
Please.
Anything else from that game?
I guess Zeke is the other guy to watch too with the knee contusion. But he came back to last week's game, was limited on Wednesday. So he should play, but it's something worth watching.
Mm-hmm. Cleveland at New England, Patriots by 2.5, over under 45. Cleveland only threw 21 passes in last week's beatdown of the Bengals in that first game without Odell Beckham. Jarvis Landry did lead the team with 5 targets, 23.8% share in that game. So Jarvis Landry's in play, knowing the risk that we already knew was there on him, that they just don't throw the ball all that much. I would expect more than 21 pass attempts in this game, but they're not going to throw it any more than they need to.
Yeah, and the big story here, of course, Nick Chubb on the COVID list, and if he is vaccinated, so he has a chance to be cleared by Sunday. I kind of consider it unlikely, but there's a chance. If he's out, you expect Cleveland to have to throw it a bit more. New England's been good against the pass, though. They're 6th in pass defense, DVOA. They're 6th in adjusted points allowed to wide receiver. So Landry like a low end wide receiver 3 for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And with Nick Chubb, if he doesn't make it back, of course, it's going to be Dearness Johnson time again, in case you dropped him after his 1-game cameo previously. I mean, you got to consider him like a top 15 running back if there's no Nick Chubb after what we got the last time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he obviously looked awesome, produced. And Demetric Felton and John Kelly are also on the COVID list. Those guys mixed in a little bit in that big Dearness Johnson game. So if they're out, you could get Johnson on the field for 80% of the snaps. So yeah, he'd be a top 15 running back play if Chubb is out.
On the Patriots side, Damian Harris, Ramondre Stevenson, both dealing with concussions. Neither one practiced on Wednesday, so that certainly doesn't bode well for the start to their weeks. Brandon Bolden becomes an intriguing RB2 if those guys are out. And I mean, J.J. Taylor is probably also in play.
Right. I'm curious exactly how the backfield would look like because, Bolden has been a special teamer and more of a pass catching back even this season. So I don't know if he'd get 15 plus carries. Maybe it'd be something close to a 50-50 split between Bolden and Taylor as far as carries go. But Bolden would still do most of the pass catching where he'd be the preferred play. But, don't go expecting Damian Harris level rushing volume for Bolden if Harris and Stevenson are out.
Yes, I agree with that. This is a Cleveland matchup that has pushed things toward the passing side, though, been tougher on the run. So it should be a decent setup for Brandon Bolden. And then the passing game, things just remain diffused here. Like everything is spread around. I don't see any changes. We talk about it every week. Somebody's going to get targets. Probably nobody's going to get a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, Jacoby Myers, like early in the season, Myers was getting the volume to be decent in fantasy. That's kind of gone away lately. He's 60th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points over the last 4 weeks. The problem has been New England started the season kind of pass leaning. They've been run heavy lately, 29th in situation neutral pass rate over the last 4 weeks. This matchup against Cleveland, who's tougher against the run than the pass, plus the running back injuries, we could see some more passing volume from New England here. So that helps Myers a bit. But Myers is still a guy I would try to bench if possible. And he has only 2 finishes better than wide receiver 40 all season. None of those have come in his last 5 games now.
Yeah, so I think if you're looking down in the range of guys like James Washington, that's where Jacoby Myers carries some upside, but certainly not somebody to be excited about here.
Yep.
Anything else in that game?
Nope. Hunter Henry just keeps scoring touchdowns, but if he doesn't, he's gonna hurt you.
Yeah, congrats to Hunter Henry and his 1 touchdown among 2 catches every week. Buffalo at the New York Jets. Bills by 12.5, over under 48. I guess the odds makers here didn't watch Buffalo's performance at Jacksonville last week. Cole Beasley did not practice Wednesday, but it looks like he's just managing his rib issue because at game time, he has 3 straight games of 9+ targets and 7+ catches.
Yeah, so Beasley, he didn't play much in the fourth quarter last week. And then, like you said, did not practice on Wednesday. It sounds like he was back out there on Thursday. So I would expect him to play. The rib thing adds some risk, especially in this game. If it goes according to plan and the Bills have a big lead, maybe Beasley gets some time on the sidelines. If you're picking between Beasley and Sanders, I would go with Emmanuel Sanders, just because he's healthy. Man, it's a great bounce back spot for this Bills offense. And I do expect them to bounce back.
I don't know if we get to Sunday and it's an active Beasley. I think I'm playing Beasley over Emmanuel Sanders, but we'll see how the rest of the practice week goes and see exactly what his game designation is before getting too deep into that one. And real quick, since he came up, we've got a question from YouTube where Matt wonders if you would trade Austin Eckler and Cole Beasley to get Tyreek Hill and Elijah Mitchell. What do you think, Jared?
I can't say I have a strong lean there. I guess I'd rather have the Tyreek side. I think what you're gaining at wide receiver there is a bit more than the loss at running back.
Yeah, I would have a slight lean that way as well. It might depend a little bit on what else is at running back because Elijah Mitchell is not a lock to keep the role that he's got, but he looks like a good bet to stay the lead back in the San Francisco backfield. So yeah, my lean would be Tyreek, Elijah Mitchell. Certainly looks like a fairly balanced deal overall. Back to the Bills and Jets. Emmanuel Sanders was back to his usual 4 catches, 65 yards on 8 targets against Jacksonville. I wonder beyond that, I mean, that's around the level he's been most of the season. We've talked about him plenty. I wonder if it might be time to stop being so sure that Stephon Diggs is going to reclaim more of the target share than he's been getting and get anywhere close to last year. I mean, Stephon Diggs is still an easy start, so it's not something to worry about. But he's looked like a strong buy to this point, and I just wonder if maybe we should recalibrate our expectations for Stephon Diggs rather than expecting that there's more to come beyond what he is doing.
Yeah, so Diggs is 13th in our expected fantasy points per game on the season among wide receivers. So, he's not getting elite top 3, top 5 wide receiver usage. He's getting low end wide receiver 1 usage. Now he's underperformed even that usage. So I do think there is some room for positive regression, but I'm with you. I don't think he's going to return to the level he was at last season.
Worth noting too, the Bills have the Colts, Saints, Pats, Bucks, Panthers, Pats coming up after this Jets game. So this matchup's fine. And obviously it's a good enough pass offense that you're not worried about them against anyone, but that's a decently tough stretch of pass defenses coming up.
And they have had such an easy schedule if you look at it so far. You know, they've played Jacksonville, Miami, the Jets they've played already. They played Houston. Like, you know, I don't know if the numbers support this, but it seems like they've had one of, if not the easiest schedules in the league so far.
Mm-hmm. Elsewhere on the Buffalo offense, I've seen lots of I'm never trusting Zach Moss ever again this week. So, I mean, are people justified in that feeling? Is this going to be an outlier of a game, or was this a shift back to Devin Singletary?
Well, so I'll say Singletary was playing more than usual before Moss got knocked out of last week's game with a concussion. So you know that mostly explains the bad numbers. I would kind of not expect him to play this week. So you want to make the Moss decision this week. And if Moss is out, I think Devin Singletary is like an RB2 with no Zach Moss back in week 1. Remember, Zach Moss was a healthy scratch for this year's opener. Singletary played 75% of the Bills snaps. He had 11 carries and 5 targets. And then in the 3 games Zach Moss missed last season, Singletary averaged 14 carries and 4 targets per game. So you get that type of volume in a pretty good matchup here against the Jets. Again, if there's no Zach Moss, I think Singletary is an RB2 play.
Yeah, I agree with that. The Bills on defense could be missing some key pieces. Slot corner Teron Johnston also has a concussion. He was limited Wednesday, so we'll see if he's able to make it back. They also called up a corner from the practice squad, I believe, Cam Lewis. So we'll see if that is an indication that Teron Johnson might miss the game. Middle linebacker Tremaine Edmonds has a hamstring injury. He did not practice Wednesday. Not sure that significantly alters anything for the offensive outlook on the other side. But, I mean, if they're missing Edmonds, it can only help somebody like Michael Carter. So on that Jets side, the Jets say Mike White is going to start this week. Zach Wilson practiced on Wednesday. He was still limited, though. I think at the very least, Mike White being better than the Jets expected, clearly, means that there's no need to rush Zach Wilson back from his knee injury. I think it's a little bit, I don't know, presumptuous to say that we're heading toward a QB controversy here after one good Mike White game. We'll see where that goes. I think they're at least well set up to not have to rush Zach Wilson back into the lineup.
Yeah, people are really saying there's a quarterback, like long-term cornerback controversy here.
That's how fans are. That's just that's the reaction time. If Mike White had one half of a good game, people are like, oh, maybe he's the guy, and it's not Zach Wilson.
White actually was really good for those 2 drives against the Colts. Like the game against the Bengals was kind of fluky. There was a lot of dump offs and yards after. He actually made some good throws in those first 2 drives against the Colts. I still don't think there's a long-term controversy, but I guess that's a discussion for another day. White is going to start this game, which is good news for Michael Carter and to a lesser extent, Ty Johnson. We talked about, the rate at which White has been targeting his running backs. It was kind of a bad break if you started Michael Carter last week because you were doing so expecting the passing game volume from Mike White, and then he gets knocked out. Josh Johnson just was not looking to dump off to his running back. So, brutal matchup for Carter against the Bills here, but I think he should get enough volume both on the ground and in the passing game to be a decent kind of floor play in fantasy lineups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Michael Carter let you down last week, but his role didn't change. I mean, 5 straight games of double-digit carries. So we've got Buffalo, Miami, Houston the next 3. Should be decent spots. This should be a particularly decent spot for his targets to return. Corey Davis sounds like he should be back for this game. Missed the past 2 with a hip injury, was officially limited Wednesday's practice, but he told reporters afterward that he went, quote, full throttle. So it sounds like he's ready to come back. 4+ catches in 4 straight games in 5 of his 6 games. Not a whole lot of upside to Corey Davis, but, should be back in the mix.
Yeah, total wait and see situation for me with the Jets here in this matchup against the Bills, who are first in Football Outsiders pass defense DVOA. They're second in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. Elijah Moore coming off, the big breakout game on Thursday night. Playing time was up. He was up to 63% of the pass routes, and he was at 37% the week prior. He saw 8 targets in that game against the Colts. But, we'll see how this shakes out now with Corey Davis back. I think Crowder's probably kind of entrenched as the slot guy. So it'd probably be Davis and Elijah Moore on the outside, but we'll have to see. Again, in this matchup against Buffalo, I would just try to avoid the situation, and we'll kind of reassess it next week.
Yeah, remain a fan of Elijah Moore long term. It's an offense I would like to not have to rely on at any point week to week for redraft this year.
Yes.
Anything else from that game?
Nope.
Jacksonville at Indianapolis. Colts by 10.5, over under of 47.5. Still no practice for James Robinson on Wednesday, so we're gonna have to watch him through the week. It sounded last week like he should be, I don't know, pretty much a shoe-in to make it back by week 10. Like they weren't even sure he was going to miss week 9. So have you seen anything more recently on him?
Yeah, the beat writer said he was on the practice field Thursday. We'll see how he's listed, but yeah, I mean, everything suggested he'll be back this week. I would still expect that at this point. Tough matchup against the Colts. The Colts are a pass funnel defense. Football Outsiders has them 26th against the pass, second against the run. They're also third in adjusted points allowed to running back. So downgrade Robinson a bit in the matchup, but he has been getting enough volume where I think he's still a pretty solid RB2 play.
Yeah, I agree with that. Trevor Lawrence also dealing with an ankle sprain. Doesn't really matter that much for him because we're not playing him anyway in fantasy, but it's enough to maybe be a negative tiebreaker on Jaguars wideouts if you have a close call between Marvin Jones and somebody else, for example.
Yeah, again, the matchup is good here. The Colts are 28th in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers, but Marvin Jones, total duds in 4 of his last 5 games now. The fifth one was a pretty big game. And he's 50th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points over those last 5 games. So even Marvin Jones has kind of become tough to rely on. Dan Arnold, I think, clearly the best fantasy play among these Jags pass catchers.
Yeah, crazy, but yeah, I agree. On the Colts side, T.Y. Hilton is dealing with a concussion, so we'll see if he's available for this game. Michael Pittman, Jonathan Taylor, obvious. Carson Wentz, we kind of hit on. He's a nice option just beyond the top 12 at quarterback. And then Nyheim Hines is the guy who, I don't want to say he came out of nowhere last week, but he had a Nyheim Hines game that makes you remember that he's there and then makes you wonder whether you should start him the next week. And the answer is usually no. I mean, largest snap share since week 3, but the snap total was not out of line with previous weeks. It was just the rushing production that was.
Yeah, he had 10 touches last week, which, it isn't even a huge number, but it was his most since week 3. He averaged 3.8 carries and 2.6 targets between weeks 4 and 8. This game against Jacksonville, the Colts are big favorites, does not set up as a Nyheim Hines game. So, I would definitely try not to use Hines if you can help it.
Yeah, it was the 4th time that he's gotten to 6 carries this year. It was the 4th time he's caught at least 4 balls. So, there wasn't anything outlierish about the game. There wasn't anything trending upward about the game other than the rushing yards that he got, and he just happened to get touches in that game. So don't overrate it. He's an option if you're digging for one, but at least as likely to let you down as help you.
Agreed.
Anything else from that game?
Nope.
Carolina at Arizona. The Cardinals by 10.5. That's up 4.5 from open. Over under 44.5 for this game. I'm guessing the lines moved because Sam Darnold's out. I'm not sure why he would be worth that many points at this stage, but Christian McCaffrey, nothing else if I can help it on the Carolina side. I mean, even DJ Moore at this point, I'm treating like DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett when Geno Smith was starting for the Seahawks.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say Metcalf and Lockett without the upside, right? Carolina signed Cam Newton this morning. He's not going to start this week. It's going to be PJ Walker. I do think Newton, maybe by next week is ready, and he might be the starter the rest of the way. Based on how Sam Darnold has played, and Darnold obviously doesn't have a future in Carolina, so we'll see about that. But yeah, McCaffrey, they said he'd be limited last week. He was kind of limited. He only played 49% of the snaps, but he still saw 14 carries and 5 targets. I would expect that just to continue to climb. He's going to get as much work as he can handle the rest of the way now with the situation at quarterback.
Yeah, he might be heading for 14 targets this week. We'll see. But he's the only thing to semi-like in the Panthers offense. On the Cardinals side, still no practice for Kyler Murray or DeAndre Hopkins on Wednesday, so we're going to keep needing to watch those guys throughout the week. AJ Green did get activated off the COVID list, so he should play in this game. But again, it's more about what happens with Kyler Murray this week.
Yeah, Rondell Moore out too the first 2 days of practice with a concussion and a neck injury. So it's honestly tough to talk about this Cardinals passing game right now just because we don't know who's going to be available. I guess, we know Christian Kirk and AJ Green are going to be out there as, basically full-time players. But if it's Colt McCoy again, that obviously hurts their upside a bit. Chase Edmonds out with a high ankle sprain. I would expect him to miss at least a month with that injury. James Conner is like a borderline RB1, might be a kind of a entrenched RB1 with Chase Edmonds out. I mean, we know he'd already been getting all the goal line work. That's going to continue. He's going to get more carries. I think he's going to get most of the passing game work too. I mean, I know he'd been basically a zero in the passing game so far this season, but he was a good pass catcher in Pittsburgh. He can do that, and he showed that he could do it last week with a big game in the passing game. So I think you're looking at 15 to 20 carries per game for Conner with Chase Edmonds out, plus a handful of targets.
Yeah, it just makes you feel good to see James Conner be one of those guys that gets the opportunity coming his way. After all the, coming back from cancer stuff, he's clearly a hard worker, seems like a likable player. So it's heartwarming.
I would stash Benjamin, though. I don't think he's going to do enough behind Conner to be a fantasy option. But, I mean, we know Conner has had trouble staying healthy throughout his career, and especially if he's going to take on a bigger workload now. Benjamin is, I think, just a James Conner injury away from taking over as the lead back here.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly worth stashing. And I think in general, kind of making that move ahead of Sunday's games where possible is a good idea at this point. Like if you have wide receivers such as, Terrace Marshall or some of the other dudes that we've been talking about where you just have them stashed and you're hoping for something and they're not usually giving you anything, when you get to the weekend, dump them for the next running back on whatever roster, somebody who's available just in case there's an injury that Sunday, then all of a sudden you're holding this asset that just shot up in value rather than bidding on them with the rest of the league.
I dropped Robbie Anderson for Benjamin in an FFPC league last night, and it felt amazing.
Watch, now it's going to be Robbie Anderson week with his college quarterback in the huddle.
Right. Sure it will be.
Minnesota at the LA Chargers. Chargers by 3.5, over-under of 53. It is the second highest over-under of the week. So certainly looks like a good spot for fantasy production. I don't think there's anything sneaky on the Vikings side. Dalvin Cook, obviously, the story with him is his off-field situation this week. It doesn't look like it's going to affect his availability for this game. We'll see beyond that. I think the fact that it's a civil case rather than a criminal charge probably increases the chances that it won't affect his playing time this year. Certainly not going to get into the details of this case because that's not what kind of show this is. But, it doesn't look like it should impact his fantasy availability in week 10.
Right, and a great spot for Cook here. We've talked about this Chargers defense being a run funnel. They're 32nd in Football Outsiders run defense DVO. So I would expect a run-heavy game plan from Minnesota here. That kind of hurts Kirk Cousins. I don't think Cousins is a great spot setter this week, despite, again, you mentioned the high over-under here. I expect it to be a high-scoring game. I just expect most of that to come from the running game for the Vikings.
Yeah, I agree. We'll see if the Chargers can jump out to a lead and force some more passing, but it looks like a run funneling matchup. We already saw a Chargers shootout with the Browns earlier this season where we had tons of Nick Chubb and still the high score for Cleveland. Kirk Cousins, is a spot starter option, but not a target. He's behind Matt Ryan, behind Ryan Tannehill in our rankings. Also a spot behind Taylor Heineke. I think I'd probably play Kirk Cousins over Taylor Heineke just because he's an easier player to bet on. And then Kirk Cousins versus Ryan Tannehill would be kind of a toss-up for me where I could see it going either way.
Yes, agree on. You could play Cousins over Tannehill and Heineke. That wouldn't bother me at all. But Derek Carr, Carson Wentz, and Matt Ryan, I prefer over Cousins this week for sure.
I agree with those. I think Tyler Conklin probably qualifies as the sneakiest play here. He's been decent lately, not terrific, but his target counts were up the past 2 weeks. And the Chargers are a neutral matchup for tight end scoring versus negative against quarterbacks and negative against wide receivers. So it could be a spot for targets to head his way, right around that fringe of tight end 1 to 2 range.
Yeah, Football Outsider says the Chargers 30th in tight end coverage. They're just 17th in adjusted points allowed to the position. I think just because they haven't faced a lot of pass volume, teams are running on them. So that's kind of the concern with Conklin. But when Minnesota does go to the air, he has one of the better matchups on that team.
Mm-hmm. Chargers side, Keenan Allen, no practice Wednesday with a knee issue. It's a new injury, wasn't listed at all last week with it. And he was in the Philly game until the team's final drive. So it doesn't seem like a big issue, but it's going to be something to watch.
Yep. Well, we'll have a better idea by Friday, I'm sure. Mike Williams, the other receiver here who had been dealing with a knee injury, he hasn't produced since that knee injury. And I was watching that Chargers game last week, and the CBS broadcast crew made a comment during the game about how Mike Williams' knee is still an issue. He's been off the injury report now. He was off it last week. He's off it again this week. This could be a spot for him to get going again, though. We'll see about Keenan's injury, but even if Allen is healthy, Minnesota 26th in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers. So I would lean towards sticking with Mike Williams, despite his slow stretch here. We saw the upside he brings early this season.
Yeah, I would lean towards sticking with him as well. It's certainly possible that the knee is bothering him, just not enough where it's affecting his practice participation or his playing time, which has also rebounded the past 2 games. So he has seen just 5 targets in 3 straight games. The matchups have been, a tiny bit harder than they were before that. Justin Herbert also just rebounded from 2 down games. So, we'll see how much of it was all of those factors coming in. Versus the first 3 games of the season, Mike Williams' average depth the target is deeper, which is going to make him a more volatile target than when he's getting shorter stuff. But that was something that started changing in week 4. So he had he had a rough game in there and then a rebound game after the first one within that range. So I don't think that that's necessarily a culprit right now. I think maybe it's the further removed he gets from that knee issue, the better bet he is to just be back to being regular Mike Williams. And we'll watch and see if he pops back up on the injury report. But, until then, he looks – a few weeks ago he looked like a sell high because we didn't think that his production was going to continue. Now he's looking more like a buy low for anybody who's panicking over the past few weeks.
Agreed.
Anything else from that game?
Nope.
Seattle at Green Bay, Packers by 3.5, over under 49.5. Russell Wilson is back. So hallelujah. We can put DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett back in our lineups. And it's been so long that I felt good about that. I almost gave DK Metcalf a different first name.
Yeah, this will be nice to see Russ back in there. He was a top 9 fantasy quarterback in 3 of his first 4 games. So I'd feel comfy getting him back in there against, kind of a mediocre Packers defense that is still without top corner Jair Alexander. So that's especially good news for DK Metcalf.
Chris Carson, is he going to play? It seems like he's leaning that way.
Yeah, I don't know. Designated to return and was back on the practice field yesterday. The vibe I'm getting is Seattle wants to get him back on the practice field and see how that neck responds. And then based on that, they'll decide whether he's ready to play or not.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation to watch. And I mean, if Carson's back in, I think we have to assume that he would be back close to his normal work, but we don't really know because it's tough to know what to make of this neck issue. It wasn't an injury that he suffered in a game. It was more like a lingering thing that just became too much for him to manage at some point.
Yeah, I think he might be back in his old role, but remember his role wasn't that strong to begin the season, even before the injury. He was losing passing down stuff to some of these other backs, including Alex Collins. So if Carson plays, he'd be my pick among Seattle's backfield, but no more than an RB3 or flex play.
Yeah. On the Packers side, Aaron Rodgers seems to think that he'll be back. We're going to have to watch because he's not officially activated off the COVID lists. But if he does make it back, we're back to treating this Green Bay offense as normal.
And this one's a little trickier to me because he can't be activated until Saturday. So he's not going to practice at all. He's going to have done nothing for 10 days coming off COVID. So I do think there's some more risk than usual with Aaron Rodgers. It's obviously uncharted territory. We haven't really dealt with this stuff prior to the last couple seasons. But I mean, at least you can feel better about Devontae Adams and Aaron Jones.
Jared, how can you say he's done nothing? He's made 2 visits to the Pat McAfee show, and he's going out in disguise to buy coffee.
That's right.
I'd say he's pretty busy. I think other players, I would worry more about that than with Aaron Rodgers. I would imagine that he's doing what he can to be ready. Plus, I mean, there aren't going to be very many players in the league who just mentally are prepared more than Aaron Rodgers. So, maybe a slight downgrade, but not anything I'm going to worry too much about heading into this game. Anything else from that Packers side before we move on?
No, I mean, the note I made about the Packers is I'm not taking much from their last 2 games because you had no Devontae Adams 2 weeks ago. So we saw them, feature Aaron Jones in the passing game, get A.J. Dillon more work on the ground. And then last week there was no Aaron Rodgers. So we saw them go run heavy and Dillon got an increased role again. So I'm kind of, again, not putting much stock into what we've seen the last 2 weeks from Green Bay.
Yeah, time to hit reset and see what happens this week. Philadelphia at Denver, the Broncos by 3, over under 45.5. Devontae Smith coming off a big game against the Chargers, limited Wednesday with an elbow issue. Not overly concerned about that unless we have reason to be by the end of the week. The stat line against the Chargers, though, to me is more of an outlier been a reason to start him this week. It does point to the upside that Devontae Smith brings to the field, but he only saw 6 targets in that game among 17 pass attempts for Jalen Hurts. And the Eagles shift from pass heavy to run heavy, a drastic shift over the past 2 games, only adds downside, I think, to Devontae Smith.
I think the Eagles, they were, I want to say, second in situation neutral pass rate over the first few weeks of the season. They're dead last in situation neutral pass rate over the last 4 weeks now. It's just a massive shift. That's hurt all these pass catchers. I mean, Devontae Smith has a 24% target share over the last 4 games, but that's equated to just 5.5 targets per game. So yeah, and Denver, I don't think Denver's offense is going to force Philly to throw it much more than they want to. So I think you're going to get low passing volume from Philly again this week.
Yeah, I think that's a reason to be wary of Devontae Smith in general. Again, there's upside if you're looking down at low wide receiver 3 range, but don't get too excited. Dallas Goedert is getting close to 30% target share since Zach Ertz left town. I mean, like with Devontae Smith, that means limited target volume because of the situation he's in right now. But at tight end, we need target volume a little bit less than we do at wide receiver. So it's enough to like Dallas Goedert. And he had an okay game fantasy-wise last week against the Chargers, just missed a longer connection when Jalen Hurts couldn't really throw a good ball with pressure in his face.
Yeah, 6 targets per game for Goddard in the 3 games since Zach Ertz was dealt. So it's a fine number, and it's not elite. I've backed off Goddard being like a top 5 option the rest of the way, just because of this Philly offense going so run heavy. I think he's more of a low end tight end one.
I do think that we'll get a little bit of regression back toward 50-50 in run pass. I mean, they've gone 64% run over these past 2 games, that blowout at Detroit and then the game against the Chargers. It's tough to imagine that continuing because that's even beyond what the Ravens did the past few years in terms of run pass split. But I do think that the shift makes Miles Sanders even more attractive as an addition before he gets back on the field. I have multiple leagues I've seen he's been available on the waiver wire so far.
Wow. Yeah, I would definitely grab him if he's available on the waiver wire. I could just see like Jordan Howard staying involved when Miles Sanders gets back. That'd be my concern, but he should definitely be owned in leagues of 10+ teams.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't overspend for Miles Sanders, but he's in a spot right now where you could probably get him for something that's not all that attractive. And then even if he doesn't do it the rest of the way, it's not a bad bet to make. And I mean, if they do keep giving the ball a lot to Jordan Howard and Boston Scott with Miles Sanders back in there, then they should just fire Nick Sirianni at the end of the season.
Yeah, agreed there. As for the backfield this week, I'd still lean towards Boston Scott as a top play. I mean, we're just guessing, though. I mean, 2 weeks ago, we thought it was going to be Kenneth Gainwell. Then last week, we thought it was going to be Boston Scott. We were wrong both times. Scott did still lead the way in snaps last week, even though Jordan Howard led in carries. I do still think Scott is, he's going to get some work on the ground. He's going to get some work in the passing game. Howard still, to me, kind of looks like a touchdown or bust fantasy play.
And Scott was the first guy on the field in that backfield last week. So I don't know that we were necessarily wrong. It looked more like a hot hand situation, and they ended up playing close to the same amount of snaps. To me, it looked like they went with Jordan Howard more because he was running well in that game, which, of course, means that can happen in any game going forward. I would lean Boston Scott, but it's similar to Adrian Peterson, Deontay Foreman. You don't really know who's going to get more carries by the end of the game.
Yep.
On the Denver side, I mean, it's just all kind of neutral plays. Not a whole lot for me to get excited about. I do like how Jerry Jeudy's usage has trended since he returned from his injury.
Yeah, the playing time was kind of back up where we need it to be. He was basically a full-time player last week. They have Jeudy playing in the slot with Sutton and Tim Patrick on the outside. Jeudy also has the lowest ADOT among these 3 guys. And we talked about this Eagles defense last week with Keenan Allen. That came through with Allen having a big game. I think that is going to be Jeudy this week. Short passes is how you attack the Eagles. I would expect Jeudy to lead the Broncos wide receivers in targets and fantasy points this week.
Yeah, and having him in the slot more, I think, can only be good for the target count, especially working with a short-range quarterback like Teddy Bridgewater.
For sure.
Noah Fant, to me, is looking a little too much like Hunter Henry lately. Much less of a good bet for targets week to week, especially now that Jerry Jeudy's back.
Yeah, it's a concern. I would say we'll have to keep an eye on Albert Okwuegbunam, who left last week's game with a knee injury and did not practice on Wednesday. If he's out, that will help Noah Fant. Fant's averaged 8 targets per game without Albert O this season, just 5.3 with Alberto. Now, a lot of those games came without Judy, obviously, so I wouldn't project 8 targets for Fant, but his volume should get a boost if Alberto is not able to play this week.
Yeah, maybe shave a couple of targets off of each of those averages with Jerry Jeudy back, and that gives you, I don't know, kind of a reasonable level of expectation. Anything else from that game?
Yep. No, we obviously got ceiling week from the backfield last week, but we can't. Gordon and Javonte Williams combined for 38 carries last week. You obviously can't bank on that. Melvin Gordon did remain the lead back in terms of both snaps and carries, so he's still the preferred play. But to me, they're both still RB3s, despite the big games last week.
Yeah, that backfield just is what it is. If you're choosing between them, then you're flipping a coin. It's Melvin Gordon has the slight lean, but it could be either of them in a given week. Kansas City at Las Vegas, Chiefs by 2.5 still. I mean, Vegas is still like, it's the Chiefs. They're going to come back at some point. Over under 52. Clyde Edwards-Helaire comes back. We'll see if he's on the active roster, but he returned to practice Wednesday, and I don't know. What are we expecting from him?
Yeah, I don't know. Before the injury, he was getting RB2 usage and producing as an RB2. He was 17th among running backs in half PPR points per game. He averaged 14.5 carries and 2 targets in his 4 full games. I would kind of expect him to get back to that. I mean, Darrell Williams, the usage has been good without CEH, but he hasn't looked special. So I would expect Clyde Edwards-Helaire to be the lead back again when he's healthy. But again, we don't know if he's going to play this week. And then if he does, we don't know if he's going to be ready to get back into that role. So he's risky this week if he's active. If not, I do still think Darrell Williams is still like a high-end RB2 just based on the usage he's been getting.
Yeah, and it wasn't a dominant lead role for CEH before he went down, so don't get expectations too high when he gets back on the field, and then we'll see about the specifics beyond that. Otherwise, I mean, about the same as usual for usability among other Chiefs options. Patrick Mahomes is certainly a few spots lower than we'd gotten used to putting him in the quarterback rankings. Every passing week makes it tougher to say it's the Chiefs and they're going to bounce back at some point.
I mean, if you drafted Mahomes and then Tom Brady for some reason, like I would bench Mahomes this week, but I don't like otherwise, like you're playing him. I do think they'll get it figured out eventually. He's just too good, and Tyreek Hill is too good, and Travis Kelce is too good. And
Andy Reid's been, calling and designing offenses for years. It's tough to imagine that they just got figured out and they can't do it anymore. So, you head into every week saying, yeah, it's the Chiefs. They're going to rebound at some point. At some point, it sounds like Tony Romo and Jim Nantz during the Super Bowl last year, where you're like, oh, now, though, they're just going to get going, and it just doesn't happen. So, I think everybody feels a little bit less good about betting on it, but you can't be like, all right, I'm benching Mahomes until something changes.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, 27.25 point implied total. Like, Vegas isn't super worried about the Chiefs offense.
On the Raiders side, Hunter Renfrow limited Wednesday with an ankle issue, assuming that he's good to go. He's a solid PPR option here. And it was a relative down week for Derek Carr last week at the Giants, threw 2 interceptions for the first time this year, but he still got to 296 yards passing and a touchdown. In his last 2 meetings with the Chiefs last year, 347-3 and 275-3.
Yeah, I think Carr is the best week 10 spot starter at quarterback, at home. One of the best matchups, should be a high-scoring game. Like you said, he's been good. He finished quarterback 18 last week. He had been a top 14 quarterback in 5 of his first 7 games. Should get Deshaun Jackson added to the mix this week, too. I don't think Djax will be a fantasy option, but, he's going to replace that speed that the Raiders lost in Henry Ruggs.
Mm-hmm. Josh Jacobs, it seems like a solid option for this one against a soft Chiefs defense. No thanks on Kenyon Drake, though. I'm not buying the 8 targets from last week.
Me either. He hadn't seen more than 6 since week 3. I mean, if there's a game for him to be busy again, it's this one, and it should be a high scoring game. They could be playing from behind. I don't know. Like I'd rather play McKissick than Drake, but they're kind of in the same tier for me.
Yeah, I would say that McKissick is a better bet to get those targets than Drake is, but it's certainly that territory. I would say Kenyon Drake is like Naheem Hines.
Yeah, that's fair.
Anything else from that game?
Nope.
LA Rams at the San Francisco 49ers. Rams by 4. 49ers have been a strongly positive matchup for quarterback scoring this year. So, I mean, it's a good spot for Matthew Stafford to rebound. Let's hope that nobody hugs him in the end zone and makes him spin and makes him throw while spinning. It's a negative matchup for tight ends, though, so maybe it's finally time for me to sit Tyler Higbee in those close decision situations.
He scored last week, man. That was a touchdown. He got robbed. Higbee led all tight ends in expected fantasy points last week. He finished tight end 11. He just continues to underperform. I kept
expecting him too.
Yeah. He just continues to underperform the usage. I mean, I don't know. I still think he's a good player and a good offense. Like, I'd still be willing to ride with him if he's been your guy all season.
Yeah, I would too. It's not somebody where you need to go upgrade on it, but maybe if I'm looking at him versus Dalton Schultz, this might be the week where I'm like, okay, it makes sense now to play Dalton Schultz over Tyler Higbee.
Oh yeah, I'd play Schultz over Higbee this week.
On the Niners side, do you have anything else for the Rams before I do that?
No, all the usuals.
Yeah, that's what I was figuring. On the Niners side, Deebo Samuel made it through last week despite the injury that had him iffy going in. George Kittle came back in a big way, and Brandon Ayuk. Is he back to being relevant? Are we suddenly looking at a Niners offense that we should be a little bit excited about?
Jimmy G's finished as a top 7 fantasy quarterback in 2 straight weeks now. I mean, it was the 2 rushing scores 2 weeks ago, but he put up nice passing numbers last week. With these guys, Deebo, Ayuk, and Kittle as healthy as they've been all season. Deebo Samuel's playing time was in line with where it's been despite the calf injury, so he seems safe to use. Brandon Ayuk, I mean, 88% of the snaps in week 8, 93% last week. He was 12th in expected fantasy points among wide receivers last week. So, I mean, he's in as strong a role as you could have hoped for prior to the season. So I think Ayuk is definitely back in play as a wide receiver 3 with upside.
Yes, I agree with that. I would say low wide receiver 3 with upside. So it's not quite enough to say, oh yeah, Brandon Ayuk is now the guy that I thought I was drafting and he's in my lineup. But if you're in a position where you think, Tim Patrick is interesting, or you're thinking about James Washington, in cases like that, I would go ahead and play Brandon Ayuk.
Yeah, I think passing volume still a concern for these 3 guys now. It's getting crowded. But playing the Rams here, the Niners could find themselves playing from behind, and that passing volume could be up on Monday night.
Elijah Mitchell's volume was up last week, 5 targets in that game. If he can continue getting some receiving stuff along with the rushing stuff, I mean, it's going to be even comfier to play Elijah Mitchell.
Yeah, that was nice to see him produce despite the, big time negative game script. 5 targets, as you mentioned, 61% of the routes for Elijah Mitchell to just 37% for JaMychal Hasty. I would have guessed it would have been flip-flopped in a game like that. So it was nice to see. I mean, we know Mitchell is the clear lead ball carrier, but it looks like even if the Niners are playing from behind, that he's going to stay involved.
Yeah, I would not treat him as a sell high right now and assume that he's going to lose significant work to Jeff Wilson Jr. I'm going forward assuming that Elijah Mitchell is going to be the lead back in that backfield the rest of the way. Not saying I'm sure of it, but that's my assumption.
I mean, we're talking about Jeff Wilson here. It's not like some big time talent, highly drafted player. He didn't play a single snap last week, and first game active off a pretty major knee surgery, so maybe he works himself into the mix. I could see him stealing some goal line work, but beyond that, I don't think he's going to be a drain on Mitchell.
Right. Before Jeff Wilson Jr. was injured and had surgery, he was behind Raheem Mostert. Even if you think that he was not behind Raheem Mostert last year, he was behind Raheem Mostert. He got work when Raheem Mostert got hurt. So a fine player, probably will be in the mix. I'm not scared for Elijah Mitchell because Jeff Wilson Jr. is back.
Yep, I agree.
Just don't tell Jeff Wilson Sr. I said that. That's going to do it for this Week 10 preview edition of the podcast. Head over to DraftSharks.com now to see our full Week 10 rankings and help you finalize your lineup decisions. Check the My Teams page to get customized projections based on your league settings. You can also find us anytime in the free DraftSharks Discord. You can find the link to join that in the description for this podcast, wherever you might be consuming it. For Jared Smola and the rest of the DraftSharks crew, I'm Matt Schauf saying thanks so much for swimming with us.